Hi, this is Richard Sassoon, and welcome to the 78th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to finish up our discussion on Iran, specifically the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we are going to be discussing today. I'm going to present this as a lay person who's interested and who cares about the heritage of this part of the world. This is also going to be a secular presentation. I'm going to try and not take sides in the various disputes and questions and issues that are going to be here, but try and give you something more neutral. And of course, like all topics in Middle Eastern history, this topic is going to be one that is divisive and difficult. So let's be respectful of all different kinds of opinions. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If the question isn't directly pertinent, I will put it in the question and answer section. We're going to have two of those because there are two different presentations. And during those question and answer sections, you can raise your hand and I will call on you and we can have a conversation if you prefer to ask your question out loud. I like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. I also have a 2-hour hard stop, so if I don't get to all the slides I want to show at the end of 2 hours, it'll just roll into the next week. When I put dates below a person, those are their years of service. If it's a political figure, if it's a thought leader, it's their lifespan. And this is a recording that you can watch later at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all the updated videos on all of our different series, and you can be updated in real time. We also would encourage you to join our meetups. The meetup link is right there, and you can be part of these conversations when they happen, so that way you can ask your questions, your comments, and be a part of the experience. And of course, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube, which all cost premium money. And that apparently does not grow on trees. And while we will continue to offer this service for free, because we think that Middle Eastern history and history in general is so exciting, we would hope that if you enjoyed your experience, that you chip in a little bit to cover the cost of those overheads. All right. So when we had talked about Iran during the Islamic Republic period, we had talked about it primarily from a domestic perspective. We talked about the development of the Iran-Iraq War and how that created a martyrdom complex within that generation. We talked about things like the combating between reformists and conservatives, where reformists, while they have the support of a vast section of the Iranian population, are consistently overruled and undercut by Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader, especially in the years after Khomeini died in 1989. And we talked about how the conservative candidates generally have the support of the Ayatollah, but not the support of the population, leading to revolts and protests. The most famous of those protests, of course, being the 2009 Green Revolution and the current Mahsa Amini protests, both in regards to the feeling that the government is not responding to the needs of the people, and especially on questions of liberalization. But we didn't really focus on Iran's external position. And it's important to note, and we're going to discuss a little bit today, that Iran during the Shah period primarily did not have an international perspective. Its perspective was that it had an alliance with the Western states, especially the United States, after the coup in 1953. And there was limited intervention in Iraq and in Oman. But by and large, the Shah maintained a defensive military position, even though he had one of the largest and best equipped militaries, probably not the best trained though, militaries in the Middle East. The Islamic Republic was fundamentally different because the Islamic Republic's ideology was an evangelistic ideology. One of the things that a lot of people, at least in my view, struggle with is that we assume that a revolutionary perspective is a left-wing perspective, that it's going to overturn the status quo in a direction that is more egalitarian, more scientifically minded, more open to dissenting opinions, that the revolution is a left-wing phenomenon. And we've seen that, for example, with the American Revolution, with the French Revolution, with the Russian Revolution. In each of these cases, a conservative kind of government was removed and a left-wing government, or a more left-wing government, perhaps we can say, replaced it. The revolutionary spirit in Iran is a conservatizing revolution. They're going in the opposite direction, but they are no less revolutionary in that they are tearing down a lot of the old structures and reinventing the perception of the role of government in personal life, the role of religion in the public square, the role of the different elements of society and how they're supposed to get along with each other. And like most revolutions, it has a goal towards expansionism. And so even though the Iran-Iraq War cut down substantially on the expansionism that Iran could do in its first decade, Iranian expansionism as an ideological construct is a fundamental aspect of the Islamic Republic, and its domestic politics don't make sense without an eye towards this international perspective, because a lot of its domestic funds and resources are allocated towards maintaining this foreign footprint. In fact, I would say, and we're going to get into this, that of the Middle Eastern states, Iran probably has the single largest footprint for any individual country. It just happens that the Sunni axis that opposes Iran's expansion is made up of several different countries that all contribute. Right? You have Egypt, you have Saudi Arabia, you have United Arab Emirates, and increasingly you have Israel contributing to that alliance as well. But let's dive into the question in Syria. So we've discussed how in 1982, as Khomeini had just come into power, he actually established a relationship with Assad in Syria. And this is a strange relationship because Assad is a secularist, and many people believe that despite being of the Alawite religion ethnically, he's rather atheistic in his own personal belief. At least Hafiz al-Assad was. And you had a person like Khomeini who was very theocratic in his orientation, but they saw themselves as allies, both in the sense that they were Shiite rulers. Alawism is, at least in the view of Khomeini, a sect of Shiism. And they're both in a conflict of interest with Iraq. Syria's conflict with Iraq is that Iraq has declared itself to be a Ba'athist state, but considered their Ba'ath party to be the true Ba'ath party and Syria's to be a false Ba'ath party. And so there's this conflict between them in that regard. There's also the feeling in Syria that Iraq has rejected the pan-Arab view of Ba'athism, where Syria continues to embrace it. On the flip side, Iran's issue with Iraq is the fact that Iraq has declared war and Iran is trying to take an Iranian province. That, and combined with the fact that Iraq is ruled by a Sunni oligarchy. So they create this friendship and relationship which endures to this day and provides Iran the ability to project power not only in Syria, but in Syria's proxy, which is Lebanon. And we talked about during the Lebanese Civil War that there were a number of Shiite militia groups that started, especially in the early 1980s, to have more and more power. Probably the most famous of them, especially at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, was the Amal movement. And you can see Musa Sadr, who is in that picture frame. He was the spiritual father of the Amal movement. And the Amal movement catered to the fact that Shiites in Lebanon were historically downtrodden and poor. And so they came at it with a sort of Marxist Islamist perspective, right? There should be theocrats in governance, and those theocrats should have a social justice platform, very much similar to a left-winger in a more progressive Western space, but from a theocratic direction. And as we remember, in Iran, there were Islamist Marxists. Abdul Hassan Bani Sadr, for example, the president of Iran from 1980 until he was deposed in 1981, was one such Islamist Marxist. But in Iran, of course, they were removed by Khomeini. These were unacceptable elements that were contradictory to his desire to establish a conservative Islamist power base. But in Lebanon, he was actually supporting these movements. So you can see that one of the fundamental aspects of Iranian expansionism is that they would align with at least nominally Shiite movements that, even though they would not be acceptable within the borders of Iran, were much more amenable to Iranian influence than they were amenable to the influence of Sunni partners, and therefore Iran could use them to wedge into a local area. Now, of course, since Amal was of this perspective, Iran wanted to create something more in its image within the territory of Lebanon, and that's where we have the origins of Hezbollah, or the Party of God. And we've talked about how in Iran, actually, you had protesters, rioters, brown shirts, perhaps we could say, controlled loosely by the Khomeiniist government called Hezbollahi. And so that's where the name also comes from, Party of God. But in their Lebanese incarnation, they become a paramilitary organization that competes with Amal for power and patronage of the Iranian state. There's a question of, is Baathism distinct from Pan-Arabism? To what extent is the 1979 revolution democratic? I'll talk about the 1979 revolution at the end of this, and the Baathism we'll definitely discuss on the Iraqi side, so I got you covered. And Iran also inserted itself into conflicts where there were no Shiite proxies. In the question of Israel versus Palestine, there are no Shiites involved in that conflict. There simply isn't a large enough population of Shiites within the borders of the historic mandate of Palestine for there to be something that Iran would consider a Shiite-based proxy, like Amal was, or like the Syrian government was, despite those groups not being in line with the Vilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, political philosophy of Iran. And so we end up seeing Iran supporting Hamas as a way to get a wedge into the conflict, especially as Arab states and the United States tend to support the Palestinian Authority based in the West Bank. And so by supporting two different sides of the Palestinian coin, by supporting the other of the two sides of the Palestinian coin, the Iranians are able to cement their image, at least in their own mind, as being in favor of the eradication of Israel, as opposed to the Palestinian Authority's position, which is much more nuanced and considering a two-state solution of some variety. Now, one of the things that is difficult to understand about these organizations, about Hezbollah, about Hamas, is that these are not, strictly speaking, terrorist organizations. Now, they certainly have elements of terrorism in them. They bomb civilian areas and kill soldiers while being in plain clothes. They're following a lot of the things that terrorist organizations do, but that's not all that they do. And one of the things that both of those organizations do is they have civil society organizations. You can see, for example, this is a Hamas-run hospital in Beit Hanun in Gaza. And so all of those doctors are certified and promoted by Hamas that allows them to run the hospital and also provides them funding for all the electrical and other needs that they may have. You can also see in Lebanon, this is a school run by Hezbollah. They are the ones who put forward the curriculum. They're the ones who hire all the teachers. Of course, as you can imagine, the curriculum is probably not American Board of Education approved, but the organizations are contributing in a socially developmental way. And this is also at the guidance of Iran, because Iran is trying to create a group of citizens in these countries that will then be more pro-Iranian in their perspective. In Syria, that has generally worked. In Lebanon, it's generally worked, where roughly half of the population in Lebanon tends to have a pro-Iranian perspective, especially among Shiite Lebanese and among Greek Orthodox Lebanese, who've been the disproportionate beneficiaries of these social services. Another piece where Iran lent its expertise, although Syria probably had more than enough of its own, was the ability to create a democracy that doesn't actually vote properly, in the sense that a democracy should, in theory, reflect the desires of its constituents. And we understand from a Western perspective that there are many ways for a democracy to not reflect what its citizens want. Probably the most common one that's cited in the United States is gerrymandering. But this is much more insidious than that. What Ghazi Kanaan did in Lebanon as the Syrian attaché was that he would set the elections in such a way that the parties that he wanted would win. He would hold them at different times. He would dismiss candidates. He would create coalitions of his own making. He would threaten candidates who were running. In many ways, these tactics mirror a lot of the more instrumentalized tactics that exist in Iran, such as how the Guardian Council vetoes roughly 50% of presidential candidates in any presidential election, how the votes are tabulated in a way that nobody can quite tell what's going on, which was one of the grievances behind the Green Revolution, saying that it's not possible that 70% of Iranian Azerbaijan voted for Ahmadinejad when Mousavi, the other candidate, was himself Azeri, and everybody knows that was his largest support base. So you have all these instrumentalizations of non-democratic means of affecting democratic outcomes. And that is the specter of Syrian control in Lebanon that we talked about during our Lebanon discussions. But you can see the Iranian knowledge and understanding of democracy manipulation that went into this occupation. Because, of course, in Syria, Hafez al-Assad had been in power as a dictator since 1970, and while he had a very effective intelligence service, the understanding of how to manipulate democratic elections was not necessarily something that would be easily accessible to him. We also talked about the Arab Spring in Syria, and of course, Iran has been a huge part of the Arab Spring in Syria as it devolved increasingly into warfare. Iran's primary position is that Assad has to survive, right? Assad is the individual with whom the Iranians put the greatest amount of interest and emphasis, and Assad also had a strong alliance with Iran. So what ends up happening throughout the Syrian civil war is that we have two different groups that are supporting Assad from outside of Syria. The first one, of course, as I mentioned, are the Iranians, and who are supporting Assad from the perspective that it is a ally of theirs in alignment on the wider Middle Eastern policy. And the second group is the Russians, who are aligned with Assad because of the port of Latakia, which is Russia's main warm water port and the only one that it has in the Mediterranean. So you end up having this relationship between the Russians and the Iranians. It starts to build over the conflict in Syria, since they're both supporting Assad. But they both have very different intentions for Assad. The Russians simply want him in power to guarantee the continual use of the port. But the Iranians actually have the idea to empower him with weapons. And so we're going to see how that mismatch of ideals is going to complicate the Iranian position in Syria. Now, there's a question about where did Syria get the chemical weapons in Ghouta? We know that Syria was developing chemical weapons for quite a while in the 60s and 70s. And we have instances of chemical attacks in Syria from that point that Assad the father was using to repress dissidents. So it's not altogether surprising that Bashar al-Assad had them. It's just Bashar hadn't used them before. So one of the, and this will tie back to the Syrian civil war in just a second. Oh, sorry. In addition to supporting Assad, and this marks one of the differences between the Russians and the Iranians supported Hezbollah in its Syrian departments in order to be the fighting force that would help keep Assad in power. And since Hezbollah is more directly responsible to Iran, Iran can command it more effectively. And even more so than that, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, was also sent to Syria in sort of an evangelistic way of protecting the revolution, right? Because the position of Syria as being this vanguard of the Iranian remaking of the Middle East, this revolutionary remaking of the Middle East, is part of the mandate of the IRGC, even though it's not a part of the mandate of the Iranian army per se, because it doesn't have to do anything with the defense of Iran proper. All of this, of course, sits alongside probably the most famous proxy conflict in the Middle East, which is the Iranian-Israeli proxy wars. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Shah, when he was in power until 1979, was an ally of Israel. Now, the two countries did not have legal recognition, but the relationship was very similar to the US-Taiwan relationship, where despite the US not legally recognizing Taiwan as an independent state, there is de facto recognition and exchange of important diplomatic personnel and a military alliance. And that's basically what the situation was between Israel and Iran until 79. After 79, however, Iran broke relations with Israel. We talked about how Israel still tried to maintain relations with Iran and even supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. But the Iranians continued to deny this assistance. And Israel finally recognized or accepted that Iran was no longer going to play with them in the sandbox. And so you begin to have a number of proxy conflicts between Israel and Iran. And we're going to talk about a few of the bigger ones in a minute, but I wanted to cover some of the smaller ones. The proxy conflict tends to be something along the lines of, if it's Iran being the aggressor in the situation, a bombing or an attack on Israelis or Jews living outside of the Middle East. Probably the most famous such attack, and to be fair, it hasn't been conclusively proven that Iran was responsible, but it's generally accepted that Iran was the EMEA bombing, which was an attack in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires in Argentina is the largest Jewish community in Latin America, in any city in Latin America. And this was a center of Jewish life in that city, and it was attacked by a terrorist. It's believed that the terrorist was financed and directed by Iran. Another one of these types of attacks is the Burgas bombing. There's a note that also the Israeli embassy was bombed in Buenos Aires in 1992. Now, the Burgas bus bombing is that there were a number of Israeli tourists in Bulgaria. Again, a terrorist attacked the bus. 42 Israelis were killed. And the Bulgarian authorities have concluded that it was an Iranian-supported terrorist attack on their soil and have reacted accordingly from a diplomatic perspective. The attacks from the Israeli side tend to be more surgical, but still very damaging. Probably the most famous one being the Stuxnet virus attack. It's unclear when the attack was initiated. Some say it could have been as early as 2005. But the Stuxnet worm is a computer virus that was inserted into the nuclear weapons facilities in Iran, in the city of Natanz. And these are facilities that are designed to enrich uranium. The Stuxnet virus altered the codes in the computer such that the reactors began to explode around January of 2010 because they had been improperly and repeatedly improperly calibrated. Another Israeli kind of strike here was the seizure of the Victoria. The Victoria was an Iranian ship heading between Lebanon and the Gaza Strip with a number of weapons destined for Hamas usage. Those weapons were confiscated by the Israeli authorities, and you can see the Israeli authorities displaying those weapons on the docks in the picture. All right. Probably the biggest interaction between Israel and Iran in this larger proxy war is the Israeli-Lebanese War of 2006. There's also a point out that Israel also assassinated numerous Iranian nuclear scientists throughout the late 20-aughts and the beginning of the 20-teens. So, but this is probably, as I said, the largest interaction between Israeli forces and Iranian proxies. This particular conflict was initiated by Hezbollah. Hezbollah believed that it could weaken the Israeli resolve by kidnapping two border troops, Regev and Goldwasser. They have admitted and then recanted, depending on how you look at it, that if they had known that the Israeli response would have been as large as it was, then they wouldn't have done it. But this was largely a war fought by the Israeli military and Hezbollah on the territory of Lebanon, where the Lebanese army was effectively impotent. Now, this became a show of the Iranian armaments and Iranian guidance that Hezbollah had. For example, they were using Soviet Katyushas, which are a missile system that Iran possesses in large quantities. And they were living in buildings that were civilian buildings, resulting in large-scale Israeli bombing. The Israeli bombing used cluster munitions and other sorts of generally unacceptable forms of munitions in the war, as well as a larger ground invasion, which you can see sort of illustrated by the launching of mortars. In Israel, this is not considered necessarily an Israeli failure, but also not a strong success. The bodies of Regev and Goldwasser were recovered through a ceasefire with Hezbollah, although those two individuals had been dead. And a number of Israeli-held Hezbollah prisoners who were alive were released as a cessation of the conflict. Israel also withdrew to its own borders, and Hezbollah has continued to have political power inside of Lebanon. In fact, as we talked in the Lebanese discussion, 2006 was just as Hezbollah was beginning to maximize their political power in a post-Syrian-controlled Lebanon context. Now, there's a question about whether or not the United States was involved in Stuxnet. I'm inclined to believe that it was. The question really is, how did the Israelis manage to get the virus into the into the nuclear facility in Natanz? Because it's not as if that facility is on the internet where the Israelis could backhack it. They needed somebody to actually get the drive into the physical factory in order to upload it into the localized servers. And it's believed that the US had contacts with dissident Iranians that the Israelis were able to use to funnel that. So that's really where the question is. We really don't know. Now, going back to the Syrian civil war and the Iranian-Israeli proxy war, this is where they meet. Russia has wanted to maintain warm relations with the state of Israel, which of course has bothered Iran tremendously. But because of this desire to maintain warm relations with the United States, with the Israelis, the Russians have permitted Israel to target Iranian arms shipments within the territory of Syria, most of them coming overland from Iraq, now that Iraq after, let's say, 2010, was more or less an Iranian puppet state. So you have the situation where the Russians and the Israelis are coordinating because the Iranians don't have an air force in Syria, whereas the Russians and Israelis can. Russia maintains one, Israel comes in from time to time, and they coordinate their strikes. And so what you end up having is that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, is aligning itself with Hezbollah to protect the arms shipments that are coming through, and Israel is trying to target those. So you end up with these numerous different strikes that started in the year 2011 but continue until the present, where Israel goes into Syrian airspace and takes out either weapons or IRGC leaders. You can see, for example, General al-Haddadi, who was killed by the Israelis in the Mazrat Amal incident. There are a number of these other similar incidents, and of course, Israeli pilots have also been taken out of the sky by Iranian surface-to-air missiles. We often think about Iran's frontier to the west and its participation in the Middle East, but we don't often think about its relationship with Afghanistan. And it's something I want to take a moment to sort of flesh out here a little bit. One of the things that is a little interesting about Islamism as a form of political thought, right? Islamism is the idea that there should be a theocracy based on Islamic law in a modern nation state, right? So it is a political philosophy as opposed to Islam, which is the religion. But because Islamism is theocratic, it necessarily has a religious component to it. And so we begin to see here the divergence between Sunni Islamism and Shiite Islamism, in that the Islamism reflects to a certain degree the partisanship that these two groups have had with each other in an ethnic sense. And we see this almost to the letter in Afghanistan. There's another thing that I want to sort of pull out when we talk about Islamism, and it's that Iran and Afghanistan are what are called national Islamists, meaning that they believe that their government is only for their country or their people. They don't believe that their government is necessarily the government for everybody else. Perhaps other people should have governments that are similar to theirs, but they won't do it themselves. They won't conquer that territory. They won't expand into that realm. You can compare this with a organization like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, which is a pan-Islamist organization. It's one that believes that the entire world should be under one unitary Islamic government, one unitary Islamist government, and that government should be ruled by insert leader here. So because these two groups are national Islamist, we should assume that their ideals and desires would not intersect unless it were the case that they had territories over which they have conflict. Now, as we talked about last week, there are questions about the Helmand River, which is a river that starts in Afghanistan, ends in Iran. And there's questions about the water allocations and so on. But by and large, Iran doesn't have any irredentism towards the former Iranian territories, let's say 200 years ago, that are now part of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan doesn't seem to want to push under the Taliban into territories controlled by Iran. But yet, while we would expect two national Islamist groups to not have any issues on that account, we actually see them having issues. So there are a few different reasons why Iran takes issue with the situation in Afghanistan, especially under the Taliban. The first one is that the Taliban, being Sunni Islamist, were extremely repressive of the Hazara. And you can see them there in the center of the picture. They look sort of something between Chinese and Middle Eastern. The Hazara are an ethnic group that live in the central area of Afghanistan. And if you look at the ethnic map, they're indicated by that sort of periwinkle color. And they are Shiite Muslims in a Sunni-dominated country and under a Sunni Islamist regime, which means that they are subject to a much larger amount of discrimination than the typical Islamic fundamentalist discrimination. Furthermore, Iran saw its role as a Shiite state to be a protector of Shiites in positions of harm or difficulty around the world. And so the Iranians began funding political parties in the Hazara community in order to push back Taliban influence in the 1990s. In fact, Iran began to coordinate extensively with the Northern Alliance, that same Northern Alliance that the United States would work with after the attack on 9/11. But Iran was working with them in the 90s in order to try and facilitate the destruction of the Taliban. That did not happen. And part of the motivation for that was not just the protection of the Hazara, but because of violent events in violent events in Afghanistan with regards to Iranians. For example, in the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, Taliban attacked an Iranian diplomatic post and killed 11 Iranians, including diplomats and journalists. And this event deeply soured relations between Iran and Afghanistan. In fact, you can see the clip there. It is a photograph, but it's a photograph from an Iranian movie made about 15 years ago, which is about the massacre and shows it from the Iranian perspective. One of the things that's unique about this movie is it goes through the propaganda as if it were completely true and shows the Iranian response and understanding of the event in their own context and view. The other issue that Iran has with the Taliban, if you can believe it, is that they believe the Taliban are too extreme. From the Iranian perspective, women have to cover, but they shouldn't be covered as much as the Taliban would have Afghan women covered, and they shouldn't be denied an education. And so you have these different religious philosophies that exist on the degree of conservatism that also spark a conflict. Because of Iran's negativity towards the Taliban, there were actually numerous negotiations that occurred during the US occupation of Afghanistan between Iran and the leadership of Afghanistan in order to promote the security and safety of Afghanistan and prevent the return of the Taliban. Obviously, these did not work, and many Afghans today, especially those who were more supportive of the US-based regime, say that Iran was playing both sides of the board. They were trying to promote infrastructure developments that would solidify the new government, but at the same time, they provided arms and weapons to the Taliban as an insurgency, hoping that those Taliban would attack Americans and cause more American bloodletting. Ultimately, those Taliban ended up being more successful than the Iranians gambled on, and the perspective of these individuals who point out that the Taliban and Iran are now at odds once more is to say that Iran was expecting to have much more leverage in a Taliban-run government in the post-2021 situation, but they overplayed their hand, and the Taliban have complete control of the country without the need for Iranian support. And this is sort of what we've been building towards and sort of alluding to, which is the Saudi-Iranian or the Sunni-Iranian proxy war, which is a proxy war led by Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, with the participation once in a while of Israel against Iran. And the result of this is that Iran has been trying to expand its influence, and the Sunni alliance has more or less been trying to hold back that expansion. And we'll sort of go through a few examples, but we have a few questions here. The first one is, does Iran promote the idea of the Mahdi as a world unifier? Yes, but they don't claim that anybody who is around is the Mahdi. They will sometimes claim that that maybe Ali Khamenei has spoken to the Mahdi, maybe he's spoken to the 12th Imam in occultation, which, by the way, is not the same thing. Sometimes they'll talk about the Mahdi being a unifier in some future point, but the difference between a national Islamist movement like Iran is, despite having its evangelical revolution spreading idea, and a pan-Islamist organization like Islamic State, is that Iran in the present doesn't have the desire to conquer all of these territories and incorporate them into Iran. So that becomes the different issue. There's a question, is this the various interpretations of the Quran in which Iran and Afghanistan view women? What is the catalyst for the diversions? I think Muslims more broadly view the Mahdi as a world unifier. Yes, on the Mahdi, that's what Muslims who believe that the Mahdi will return, and the Mahdi is a contentious subject, especially in Sunni circles. But the view is that he will prepare the world for the return of the Messiah, which is Jesus, and Jesus will proclaim the truth of Islam at the end of days. But while this is certainly a part of Islamic eschatology and something that the Iranian government does discuss, it's not part of what they officially promote in the sense of their package for how to build more and more aligned states. As to the question of the interpretation of women, I think that in Iran, it's much more of a practical consideration than it is a religious teaching necessarily. Under the Shah, women had gotten more rights starting in 1963. And to try and roll that back would have gotten an immense amount of backlash. I mean, I think the entire Masa Amini protest of people are in the streets yelling and chanting because a woman was killed for not wearing a headscarf. If Iran had pushed for much more conservative clothing from the top down, it may have received more backlash than it would know what to do with. And so having women in the Iranian government and having women in the Iranian public space has become part of that culture. And the Ayatollahs have sort of bent along with it. At least that's my view. Of course, a religious person might say that these views have a long history and so on and so forth. So if we look at the specific examples of the proxy war, we see in each case, as I said, that Iran is almost always expanding its influence, and the Sunni axis is losing it over time. Probably the clearest example of this is the Houthis in Yemen. Yemen, prior to Arab Spring, was a Sunni-controlled country, despite the fact that the northwestern part of the country has a Zaydi Shiite majority. Now, Zaydi Shiites are a different type of Shiite than the type of Shiite that predominates in Iran and Iraq and Azerbaijan. Those are called Twelvers. But Zaydis, because of their common Shiite heritage, were a place where Iran could pour support. And they poured support to the Houthi rebels who were existing in northern Yemen. And that support effectively led their revolution to take over Sana'a, which was the capital of a unified Yemen, and deep within the heart of North Yemen territory. And the Saudis ended up trying to buttress the government of President al-Hadi to a greater or lesser extent. Now, one of the things that you may notice if you look at the map of Yemen is that some areas are shaded in black, and those are areas that are under the control of, depending on the year, Al-Qaeda Yemen or Islamic State Yemen. So those are areas that are outside of the control of the Iranian proxies in the case of the Houthis, or the Saudi proxies in the case of the president and his forces. Now, it's worth pointing out that there are a number of allegations that the Sunni axis supports Islamic State and other fundamentalist groups. Usually there's been indictment on specific individuals. It's more difficult to ascertain whether or not the governments are behind it. But that is certainly the Iranian accusation. Another case where Iran's proxies have been able to expand their power is in the case of Iraq. So the case in Iraq is that the US-based occupation did not resolve all of the military issues that existed in the country, especially with the rise of Islamic State in 2014. And it turns out that the Iraqi military was in no way capable of holding back the storm. And we'll discuss more about that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks when we get to the war in Iraq and its aftermath. the American-led war in Iraq and its aftermath. But part of what Iran had done is that they had already cultivated a political class that would be supportive of them by the late 20-aughts, but now they began to create a militia that would be responsive to their interests. Not to say that there hadn't been one before. There were numerous Iranian-supported militias like Asa'ib al-Haq, for example, that existed in the southern region. But by far and away the most effective and largest of these militaries or militias is the Popular Mobilization Force. The Popular Mobilization Force is primarily composed of Shiites, but it accepts individuals from all of Iraq's different ethnic and religious backgrounds and unifies them in opposition to both Islamic State and Western-aligned militia groups. They have effectively become the enforcers for the much weaker Iraqi much weaker Iraqi prime ministry, and similar to Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon, help guide political policy through their political representation and their ability to affect their will on the streets. In many cases, this is the same playbook as Iran used in Lebanon during the Syrian occupation, now applied to Iraq. And accordingly, Shiites are having a disproportionate power in Iraq. Not to say that as the majority that they wouldn't, but their power is further expanded through the Popular Mobilization Forces and other similar militias. The situation between Iran and Saudi Arabia themselves was fraught with difficulty. In 1987, the two sides broke off relations, primarily in the context of the Iran-Iraq war, where the Saudis were supporters of the Saddam government in Iraq, refusing Iranian incursion. And those relations were not restored until March of 2023. There were a number of compounding incidents throughout this period that caused these two countries to continue to refuse to have relations, in addition to the proxy wars themselves, that concerned domestic policy. Iran is one of the only countries in the world with a Sunni Muslim population that has no Sunni mosque in its capital city. And in fact, while 1/3 of Iran's population is believed to be Sunni of some stripe, the Sunnis in Iran have very little political power, and Sunnism is not recognized as a religion in Iran, meaning that Sunnis have to pray, if they want to pray, in Shiite mosques. Conversely, Saudi Arabia's oil-rich Qatif region, that's the region that borders the Persian Gulf, has been separatist for quite a while, and the Saudi response to separatism is, well, arrest and execution. So one sheikh who was advocating for increased rights for the Shiite minority that lived in that region, they're a majority in the region, but minority overall in Saudi Arabia, who was Nimr Bakr al-Nimr, was arrested by Saudi authorities in February of 2016 and later executed for treason and other crimes against the state, despite the fact that he had done no action that would merit that kind of charge if he had said the things that he said in a Western state. It's unsurprising that Iran commented in defense of this Shiite preacher, but even Western countries condemned Saudi Arabia for the brutal treatment of Nimr Bakr al-Nimr, and in many cases, it's very similar to the reaction that Westerners had to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Saudi journalist working in Turkey for a Turkish newspaper. There's a serious question as to what the restoration of relations under Chinese auspices between the Saudis and the Iranians will mean. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the Eurasian context in a few minutes. One of the losses that the Saudis have really begun to feel in the proxy war that they're having with Iran is the situation in Lebanon. Saad Hariri was from the, let's say, anti-Syrian coalition. We talked about this much more in depth in the Lebanese presentation. But as a member of the anti-Syrian coalition, his alliance is more naturally felt with that Sunni axis, right? Because Syria is part of the Shiite axis. But even Assad Hariri had to have meetings with Iranian delegations because Iran is a key supporter of several parties in the Lebanese government and a lot of its funding. The whole debacle between Assad Hariri being kidnapped by Saudi authorities in Saudi Arabia, being forced to recant Iranian connections to Lebanon, and then eventually making it back to Lebanon, meant that Lebanon basically fell fundamentally out of the Sunni axis permanently. And Saudi definitely overplayed its hand and its power here. There are two questions. One's on China and one's on Jews, and I'll get to those in the question and answer. So we talked about during the Shah's period that Iran seized the Greater and Lesser Tun Islands, which is a claim that the current government in Iran still supports and still fights the United Arab Emirates in getting, which is why the United Arab Emirates is deeply distrustful of Iran. But Oman, in the post-revolutionary period, still treats Iran as the ally it was in the pre-revolutionary period. We remember talking about the Iranian soldiers in Dhofar in 1973, which effectively secured the kingship for Sultan Qaboos, who ruled for just short of 50 years. And the Omanis have decidedly played a neutral role in facilitating Iranian outreach to other parties in the wider Middle East. They've been a linchpin for Iran-Iraq negotiations during the Iran-Iraq War. They've been a linchpin for the negotiations concerning the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is all the other Gulf states and Iran, making sure that the Persian Gulf remains relatively safe, despite those countries not recognizing each other half the time. And they also played a fundamental role in bringing together the Iranians and the Americans and other Western powers for the negotiation of the Joint Coalition Plan of Action, also colloquially known as the Iran Treaty or the Iran Nuclear Treaty. And so the Iran-Omani relationship has grown significantly through trade, through oil subsidies and natural gas provision from Iran to Oman, because Oman's unique diplomatic perspective allows Iran a way both around sanctions and into the international community with countries that it cannot seem to mend relationships with on its own. With regards to Egypt, Iran has had a very difficult relationship with Egypt in the post-revolutionary atmosphere. We've discussed how Nasser and the Shah did not get on terribly well, but the Shah did have a rapprochement with Anwar Sadat. So naturally, Anwar Sadat's assassination and the Shah, only 1 year after the Shah was deposed, would put those relationships on rocky ground. In fact, the Shah fled to Egypt as his country of exile when he left Iran. Iran, in a way, retaliated for the respect shown to the Shah after his deposition by promoting Khalid Islambuli, who was the man who assassinated Anwar Sadat. In fact, naming an entire street after him in the heart of Tehran. Mubarak and Sisi have both broken relations with Iran. They were rekindled for a bit under Morsi, but that was the high point. There are negotiations going on in Oman, surprise, surprise, to try and rebuild the relationship between Egypt and Iran. But so far, those countries still do not have diplomatic relations. It's further complicated by the fact that Khamenei is supporting Hamas, and Hamas is something that most Egyptian generals see as a serious threat to the stability of the Sinai Peninsula, in addition to its alliance with the United States. which, again, the Iranians are not terribly sympathetic towards. To Iran and the Caucasus. So, as we've mentioned in several of the earlier presentations, Iran has a historic place in the Caucasus. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the eastern half of Georgia, Kartli and Kakheti, for those who are familiar, have historically been part of the Iranian empires, such as the Safavids, the Afsharids, and the Qajar until the 19th century. And so Iran has a sense that these regions, in a way, are part of its cultural sphere. It's what's called Iran-e-Buzurg, the Greater Iran. And to that effect, Iran has tried to maintain relations with all three of these post-Soviet Caucasian states. When the states became independent, its view was primarily pro-Armenian, but pro-Armenian slightly, despite having a large Azerbaijani minority, roughly 9 million people, between 9 and 15 million people, depending on how you count them. Iran saw an independent Azerbaijan as a long-term threat, and we'll get through why that is. But because of that, they saw Armenia as an access point, similar to Oman in that it was a neutral country that could maintain relations with other states and serve as a way for Iranians to get out of Iran. And that became the relationship that existed during the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, where the Iranians did not support either side, but at the same time, they didn't stop the Armenians from winning the key victories in 1988, 1994. Iran and Armenia also have large-scale cooperation with regards to energy. Armenia has nuclear reactors and nobody to send the electricity to, and Iran has petrochemicals and can sell them to the Armenians. As I said, Iran's bigger fear is of an independent Azerbaijan. And the reason for that fear is twofold. The first one is irredentism. The Iranian leadership is afraid that either Azerbaijanis in the northeastern part of Iran will try and declare independence, as they did in 1946, or they will be inspired by the Republic of Iran to either join it or go their own way, or some other combination, and create some irredentist Azerbaijani state. I think that this is probably the most maximal claim of Azerbaijani irredentism. I haven't seen something else, but in this view, you can see all of Iran's northwest being taken by the Azerbaijanis in red and green, and you can even see the entirety of the modern country of Armenia being absorbed into this Azerbaijani state. And yeah, so this the situation here is particularly frightening to Iran's national security. Also, Iran and Azerbaijan share a Shiite population, but a fundamentally different government. The government in Azerbaijan is a secular government. And while a secular government is not a threat in a place like Syria, where it doesn't pose a direct threat to the viability of the concept of the government of the jurist, having a secular government right next door with people who speak literally the same language on the other side of the river is a threat to the viability of the Iranian state as a theocratic country. And that bothers them. But probably the most difficult thing for them to stomach is that Azerbaijan and Israel have a very strong relationship built on their mutual ability to satiate the needs of the other. From the Azerbaijani perspective, the Israelis are incredibly useful from the perspective of maintaining Azerbaijani independence, strengthening their military, providing intelligence, and antagonizing Iran, perhaps we could say. From the Israeli perspective, Azerbaijan is a basic source of hydrocarbons that Israel needs to function and protect itself from its own enemies. And so that relationship has built and deepened over the years, with Israelis continually going to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijanis even serving as a negotiating partner for Israelis in repairing their relationships with Turkey, with which Azerbaijan maintains very close relations. So the Israeli position being so close to Iran's borders and being able to examine the situation in Iran is something that Iranians are deeply worried about. Finally, when it comes to Georgia, the Iranians haven't had a clear position on Georgia. Relations have generally been improving, but the Rose Revolution was something that Iranians deeply disliked, because the possibility of Georgian rapprochement with the West, and therefore its leaving both the Russian and Iranian spheres of influence, would mean that Iranian power there would lessen. That said, there are a number of infrastructure projects going on between Georgia and Iran, and increasingly Iran is becoming a partner in the larger Georgian economy. In the last Nagorno-Karabakh war, which took place in December of 2020, again, Iran stayed neutral, but this time their commentary on the war was more measured and less pro-Armenian than it had been in 1994, showing that perhaps there is an increasing Azerbaijani consciousness in the northern part of Iran that hadn't existed in the late 80s, and the Iranian government is worried about not appeasing. That said, even in the Azerbaijani majority parts of Iran, Armenian sites are still protected in a way that they're not in Iranian territory. For example, you can see the Saint Stepanos Monastery, which is on the southern side of the Aras River. On the northern side of the Aras River is Nakhchivan, the autonomous separate republic of Azerbaijan, where Armenian historic religious artifacts like the Khachkar and like a number of churches have been intentionally destroyed, both during the period of Azerbaijani independence and during the prior Soviet period. And so now we get to the Eurasian period. And so I wanted to address the question, what is China's intention of using soft power philosophy, the end goal of uniting Iran and Saudi Arabia? The end goal is primarily to have two suppliers of fuel as opposed to one. China is a massive fuel consumer, and in fact, China is Iran's and Saudi Arabia's biggest client in terms of oil exports. But more importantly, perhaps, is this concept of the Eurasian unity. And what we're beginning to see is that there is a rejection by the Russians and the Chinese of the international world order. And it started as early as 1997, but it has grown in terms of its breadth and its ability. And this new global order rejects the idea of the Western created Bretton Woods institutions. It holds that there is no need to implement human rights or a human rights-based perspective. Rule of law and democracy are not necessary, and that there should not be an interference in the internal affairs of other countries from a perspective that they don't enforce these other kinds of norms. Now, as is quickly noticeable from these objectives, there's no actual objective here other than the resistance towards the West. So unlike, for example, communism, which the Soviet Union spread for close to 60 years, there is no goal to which these states are aspiring. There's no place to which they're going to go. And so you end up with this situation where these countries are all unifying together over the prospect of not being democracies. And accordingly, there's minimal defense coordination, there's minimal economic coordination beyond what you would expect from countries that have a friendly relationship towards each other. Certainly nothing close to a NATO construction. And in fact, groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization put arch rivals like Pakistan and India, or India and China, or Iran and Afghanistan together under the same aegis. But we do see that because China and Russia are trying to create this Eurasian alliance, that Iran has increasingly been brought into this sort of sphere over time. And so while the historic relationship between Russia and Iran, especially in the 19th century, was one of adversaries, the Iranian government, especially as Western sanctions have made it more and more difficult for them to operate, has seen Russia as a benefactor and become part of this sphere, and China as a consumer, and incorporate itself into that sphere. From the Russian side, the Russians helped to build the Bushehr nuclear plant, which is a power facility that exists in Iran using uranium enriched within Russian territory. And Iran has, in fact, returned the favor when it came to the war in Ukraine, where Russia can't produce as much military hardware as it would normally like. And so Iran is producing that military hardware and sending it to Ukraine, probably the strongest single ally Russia has in the conflict in Ukraine. And so we're beginning to see this new kind of behavior, but by and large, Iran is the third party in this relationship. Russia and China are really governing it and organizing it. And while Iran is increasingly integrated, it doesn't have a lead seat at the table. And so in many ways, this is just another form of imperialism, admittedly one that Iran is choosing for itself, under the idea that their internal politics won't be questioned by either Iran or China. So questions, comments, clarifications on this part of the presentation. There's the one question of, where do Jews in Iran worship? Jews in Iran tend to worship in synagogues. There are synagogues within the Islamic Republic. There aren't that many of them, especially considering that the Jewish population in Iran before the revolution was 600,000 people. Many of the synagogues have either closed down or been closed. The bigger issue for Jews in Iran is not worship. The bigger issue for Jews is education. So in the context of Jewish education within Iran, there is the fear by the Iranian government that Zionism could infiltrate the Jewish curriculum. So a Shiite principal is required at any Jewish religious school, and Jews would go to Jewish religious schools so they're not taught Islamic religion, which is, of course, part of the curriculum at a normal public school. But a Shiite principal has to be there to make sure that no Zionist elements are snuck in. And so you have serious questions in the Iranian education system of, is next year in Jerusalem, which is said at the end of Passover celebrations, is that a call to Zionism? And generally speaking, the Iranian government has believed that it is. And you have other sorts of things like that, where any positive mention of Israel, any positive mention of the territory that Israel controls, and similar by the Jews of Iran in a public space, is basically not allowed. And since the Jewish representative in the Iranian parliament, Jews get one representative, Armenians get one, Assyrians get one, and Zoroastrians get one, is vetted by the Guardian Council. So in many respects, he's a mouthpiece for what the Guardian Council wants to say, which is no different from any other Iranian politician, but it has the added sting of being part of tokenism as well. There's a comment here that Iran provides drones to Russia against Ukraine. Yeah, that's the Muhajir and the Shahid drones. Both of those are in operation. And one of the curiosities for Iran is that this provides it a means of testing its own technology against Western weaponry without directly involving itself in conflict, which is a unique opportunity for Iran, and one that the US used to exploit by giving its weapons to other people around the world.
been bothering me, and I know I've been harping on this, but in the recent war between Karabakh war between Azeri and Armenian war, where did Iran stand, and why wasn't it that? I mean, Turkey had such an involvement, right? It was
Sure.
Erdogan supported, Azerbaijan openly. Russia took a kind of sidestep, didn't really get involved, due to the fact that Armenian president, they call them Soros supporters. I guess I don't know what they.
But the question is, why didn't Iran get involved? Iran needs its relationship with Armenia to get access to the rest of the world, because Oman can't handle everything. So Iran has a stronger relationship with Armenia than it does with Azerbaijan, and I pointed out how Iran is worried that Azerbaijani control will effectively allow an Israeli ally, more or less, to be right on its border. But they don't want to directly fight Azerbaijan because they have such a large Azeri population in their own country that if they did that, there might well be a revolt. So it's trying to thread the line by not doing anything but saying, strongly worded statements of go home and stop fighting.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. All right. And I will explain a little bit about who we are. We are History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. You have been watching Middle Eastern Islamic History, which is Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. And next week, we will pick up from this point and discuss the development of Abdul Karim Qasim's government, the government of the Arif brothers, the government of the early Baathists like Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and as far as we can into the reign of Saddam Hussein. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to take off the July 4th week. So we're not going to meet on July 5th, but on July 12th, we will come back and we will finish Iraq, starting hopefully with the American-led invasion in 2003 and continuing through the present, including things like Islamic State and so on. After Iraq, we'll probably pan over to Turkey for a few weeks, and we'll begin to close out these seminars. We also have Asian philosophy with Jason Peng, European Union security that I and Aaron do on occasion. We have Powerful Women in Dead Languages by Jane Prendergast and John Maloney. There should be an episode coming up this month of each of those. And we've got our short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War, where we'll probably have an episode on Saturday. I want to say July 8th, but that's open to discussion. Of course, you don't have to keep up with our current series. You can see our older series, and our older series are all finished. You can see them and examine all those different kinds of things. Stuff as strange as, are Tolkien's dwarves Jews? What is the history of sport? What's the history of wine? What are some battles in World War II, like Kursk and others? And so I encourage you to go to our YouTube page. The link is on the page right here, and you can see those presentations. All right. So there's a question of where can you watch episode 58? You can watch all of those episodes at the YouTube link that you can see here, where it says please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's the point that the series is coming to an end. The series is not coming to an end soon. I still have probably about 8 weeks left. But I have a life and a wife, and or I'm going to have a wife. And if I continue this series, I might not have a wife. So something for me to look forward to as well. All right. Thank you everybody for coming, and I'll see everybody next week. All right.
I'll post the slides on the on our YouTube channel. If you guys join there, I'll post the slides in the community tab.
Okay, that works. And you
Okay.
have all my presentations, so you can just upload them. But just so you guys know, my slides don't actually have notes on them. Like, it's not like that if you had the slides that you could do the presentation. I see the same slides you do. I just remember from the pictures what I want to talk about.